You've reached Hotel Pacifico, your 5-star destination for BC politicos. Press 4 for room service. Press the star key for your hosts Mike McDonald and Kate Hammer.
Welcome, guests, to the Hotel Pacifico. This week, I'm here and Kate's gone. We just can't get it together. But I do have our old friend Geoff here who's going to help out with the interview today. Geoff, thanks for coming in and being a part of it. 2 weeks in a row, geez.
Well, I know Kate Hammer and I'm no Kate Hammer, so I'll do my best.
I knew Kate Hammer, and yes, sir, you are no Kate Hammer. To quote Lloyd Benson, obscure political reference for those who remember the 1988 vice presidential debate. Anyways, today we have a guest who's anything but obscure. We're glad to be joined by Don Wright, former head of the public service, and many other hats he's worn over the years. I'm going to take a moment just to recite some of Don's bio for our audience who may not be as familiar with Don as we are. And I'm going to have to read it because there's so much, but I'll just hit the highlights. First of all, Don was the head of the public service under Premier Horgan from 2017 to 2020. Unfortunately, it was a 4-year delay for Don on that particular mission, but he did fulfill it, and to wide acclaim. He had a triple threat career, which is still happening incidentally, of academia, business, and government. He's even got a PhD from Harvard, I think. So he's definitely, as you can see, a bit of a pointy head if you're watching on YouTube. He's been the CEO of Central Credit Union. He's been the head of BCIT. He's really moved effortlessly between business, government, and university life, and brought a really rich perspective to the roles he's taken on. And we're delighted to have him join us today to share his wisdom and expertise. Welcome, Don, to the Hotel Pacifico.
Oh, well, thank you for the invitation. Quite flattered.
Well, that's what we like our guests to say. Thank you.
Great to see you, Don.
So,
Geoff.
Don, I want to take you back briefly to October 11th, 1967, where I'm imagining a leafy enclave of Saskatoon, a teenage Don Wright was watching the election results come in on the night of the Saskatchewan election, with the Wright family gathered around their tote boards, tabulating results, riding by riding, listening to radio stations and the one TV station in Saskatchewan to follow a dramatic election that led to the re-election of Premier Ross Thatcher, Liberal. Maybe the last time a Liberal was elected Premier of Saskatchewan. And the Wright family and you and your friend David were drinking it all in. And yet, despite that, you did not pursue a career in elected politics. You were interested in politics, though. You were interested in government at that time, obviously.
Yeah.
Not taking the bait, Geoff.
Well, do you want me to tell you why I didn't pursue politics?
Why not, Don?
Well, you obviously came from a family that was highly interested in what was happening in the world around you.
Yeah. So certainly really interested in government and in public policy. But there's two reasons why I don't think I ever went the political route. One is I am a bit of an introvert. And I think politics is a real tough gig for an introvert. And then the second thing is my father was a longtime councillor and mayor of Saskatoon, and it was a relatively gentle time back then. So this would be the 70s and the 80s. But even at that, I saw the abuse that somebody in elected office took. And it rolled off his back, but it certainly really bothered my mother. And I just said, I don't think that's the world I want to live in. So that's the best explanation.
So you found out other ways to serve.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, Don, let's start close to the end, having been back to the beginning with Mike's question. But in 2017, to the shock of many of us on this call here, the Lieutenant Governor called John Horgan to form a government, and he called you to become head of the public service. So that was a dramatic change after many years of BC Liberal administration. What did you do or not do, and what was the kind of touch you decided to put on things as you came into that very, I would say, fragile and unstable situation?
Yeah, it was fragile and unstable, Jeff. I remember when I agreed to come in, I kind of gave myself some consolation saying, well, it's probably only likely to last 6 months. So what's the big deal? Well, to everybody's surprise, it lasted longer. What I brought to it was a real respect for the role of the public service. And that in a good functioning government, there needs to be the proper relationship between the people elected by the people and the permanent public service. And so I brought that. I didn't believe all of the complement of deputy ministers that I was inheriting were fit for purpose. And so I went through an interview process where I talked to all of them. And on the day of the swearing in, most of the deputies stayed. Some were assigned different roles, but some of them just didn't fit in. And so we thanked them for the service and sent them on their way.
I think
yeah.
maybe observers felt there might have been more change. And I think my read was that, you were sending a message of stability at that time, that by maintaining a lot of that senior leadership in the public service.
Yeah, no, I definitely was trying to do that because again, I respect the professionalism of most of the public servants, and just because they had served Christy Clark, in my mind, didn't disqualify them to serve John Horgan. And in fact, one of the things that may surprise people to know that both the Premier and I tried really hard to get Kim Henderson, who was the person previously in the position, to stay on. And, she was flattered, but she respectfully turned us down. And I just think that, and I had the support of Premier Horgan on this. He was always very positive about the public service. So, no, don't just make a point of sending a bunch of people down the road just to make a point, because the point you're making wouldn't be a good one. So, yeah.
You had
I think
served.
it's different in a minority situation, Don, than it would be in a majority. Given that you thought, and probably across my mind too, we might be there for a good time, not a long time. That it was more important to maintain that stability. Would you have a different approach if it was a majority administration?
I don't think I would have, Jeff. Each of the ones that I decided to keep on, there was a reason for that. Either I thought they knew their portfolio well, or that it would send an important signal to the public service and or the outside world. I'll give you two examples. One was keeping Stephen Brown on at the Ministry of Health. The minister came in with a bit of a concern about the ministry because of the pharmacare. I forget what we even called that scandal back then. But the Premier and I thought it was important to keep Stephen in place, and the minister worked with him, and they ended up having a very good relationship. The other
to this day.
Yeah, to this day, to everybody's surprise, I think. The other one was a decision to not just keep Fazil Millar on, but actually to promote him to be the first deputy minister of economic development. And my thinking there was I wanted to signal to the business community that this wasn't some crazy administration that was going to be disrespectful of the needs that the business community had. And so that was a signal. And as you know, I took some internal heat for that, but I still stand by that decision.
Well, Geoff, I think, on a political basis, perhaps the incoming administration had remembered some lessons from the 90s about antagonizing the business community, or perceived to have been antagonizing the business community. So from a political level, that approach seemed to square with calming the waters in a minority government situation.
Yeah.
I think there was that, but also you have to make a judgment, I think, and Don showed an enormous capacity to make those judgments about maintaining that continuity so things can actually get done. And that's why I raised the majority minority thing. If
Yeah.
you think you're going to be there for 4 years, maybe you're prepared to tolerate some more upheaval early on, but there was no margin for upheaval. We'd had plenty. So anything that could put some oil on troubled waters was good news. And certainly experienced deputies would be part of that solution,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
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 Don,
And
what do you think? What do you think are some of the traits of the BC Public Service that maybe set it apart from other provinces in Canada? Like, do we have a unique public service here? Do we operate differently? Do we have a certain brand with the public service here in BC that's unique?
Well, it's hard for me to definitively opine on that. But I can give you some impressions. And when I say I can't definitively opine on it, my experience in Saskatchewan is almost 40 years old now. So what the public service is there now, I don't have much of a sense. But I think that there's a few things that stand out. It's very lean. So if you look at the number of public servants per population, it's perhaps the leanest civil service in the country. And consequently, it's had to adapt ways of doing business consistent with that. So, you'll make decisions without the same ponderous, going through multiple levels. It doesn't have as many levels as, say, the Alberta government does. I also, and I don't take any credit for this, I think Kim had done a very good job on this. It was quite forward-looking. So they had, devoted some resources to actually imagining what the future of the public service was. And they had interesting little units that were doing, behavioral studies, how do you nudge people to make the right decisions? They were doing that type of stuff. We were doing a lot of stuff digitally that the rest of the country was slower to do. So I think those are the two things that I would point out.
I'd like to lead the witness here a bit, Don, but
Okay.
I had a friend who was you did a huge outreach program to public servants in the first year or so, and had many town hall meetings which were open to hundreds of people. So your views were widely known. You're very accessible. But one friend of mine who I had known in previous life and then wound up in the public service came and said he was very struck by a comment you made in one of those town halls at your dismay at how policy making or the policy making capacity of the public service had been hollowed out. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that, because the policy makers, the pointy-headed nerds with the big pads, are usually the first to go on any downsizing. Did you really see a change between 2017 and your earlier visits to the public service?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point, Geoff. Yeah, so my last tour of duty ended in 2003, and in the 14 years over that period of time, I saw a real hollowing out of what I call the policy muscle. So the policy shops were shrunk, and government tended to have taken on more of a transactional feel to it. And there's reasons for that aren't totally connected to the hollowing out. But what struck me is when we wanted to take a look at some significant changes, you generally like to have people that can think those through, because every problem in government has multiple parts and they're all moving at the same time. And that was a bit of a struggle. We just didn't have as much as we used to have. So yeah, that's a good observation, Geoff. I had kind of forgotten what I said, but yeah.
Well, there's different models, right? And in the 90s, there infamously Cupcakes was set up by the Harcourt government, I believe, which was, I think, a combination of communications and policy coordination, which drew some flack at the time, but can appreciate the need for centralized coordination of initiatives. Now, my read on the Gordon Campbell years where Gordon was a policy shop unto himself.
Yeah.
And he drove a lot through his management style in terms of some of those policies. There wasn't much of a central policy shop at the outset in 2001. And maybe, I'm not sure whether you perceive that the policy making or policy advising capacity ministry by ministry diminished over time. Do you feel that was the case?
Yeah, it was more the latter.
Yeah.
I'm personally not a big fan of big central
Yeah.
policy agencies. I think most of what you have in that regard should be located in a well-functioning Ministry of Finance, and that in the Premier's office, you want to have the ability to kind of track issues, monitor issues, manage issues, and think about the communications. But you really should be, and this is a personal view, you should be relying on the policy shop in the Ministry of Forests or the policy shop in the Ministry of Health to be doing more of that holistic thinking about problems that have to be solved.
A key feature in the 2000s, which you were there for at least part of, was Gordon Campbell's core review process, which was an attempt to sort of question all of the activities of government and see if they aligned with the government of the day's, key objectives.
Yeah.
What was your experience of that? Do you think that was a healthy process? Was it, hard at the time and good in retrospect? What was your take?
Yeah,
Where were you at that time, Don? Were you in forestry or were you?
Yeah, I was Ministry of Forests at that time. Yeah. Any type of core review that I've ever been involved in, you would never describe it as a fun process. It's painful. In Forest case, for example, we ended up eliminating 35% of the positions in the Ministry of Forests. We shut a number of regional offices down, a number of district offices down. And, I don't want to make too much of it, but I remember when I pushed send on our final plan, I was in my office and the doors closed and I started crying because the thought of the disruption that this was going to entail for so many good public servants around the province and the communities was pretty upsetting. Having said that, I think governments do need to do something once in a while that really start to ask the core questions. Do we need to be doing all the things we're doing? And are we doing them in the most efficient manner possible? Because the incremental year over year decisions, it's basically, okay, let's add some more bodies and some more functions into Ministry X. And it just gets incremental and layered on top of each other. And from time to time, I do think you need to do a little bit of spring cleaning, painful though it is.
Well, in that particular time, my recollection is that the overall budget for government continued to go up. However, healthcare went up a lot at the expense of forestry, at the expense of dirt ministries, and some other social ministries too.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I'm not sure what the percentage of healthcare vis-a-vis the provincial budget is today. Is it half? Is it?
I think it's probably getting close to, I would, I haven't looked at it recently, Mike, but I'd guess it's 45% or so.
Yeah. And I think when Campbell entered government in 2001, it was probably 35%, right? Yeah. So there's just this issue of an aging population and a healthcare system that constantly needs reinforcement that eats the rest of government spending. And when you were in the chair from 2017 to 2020 as head of the public service, like how did you wrestle with those kind of trade-offs where, you've got one big consumer of spending that's always going to need it, and you've got to deal with a whole bunch of other priorities?
Yeah. Well, I'll do a little bit of a Glenn Clark on you here. One of the bits of very good luck for the government is when we, by fluke, more or less, found that we were in power. We were pleasantly surprised to find that my former minister from way back when, Mike DeYoung, had been sitting on a fairly nice surplus that I'm not even sure his colleagues knew about. And so,
I'm not even sure he knew.
Well, he probably knew, in the sense that his approach to budgeting was very conservative assumptions, kind of plan for the worst and hope for the best type of thing. I mean,
he still drives a 94 Miata, so
yeah,
there you go.
I've been known to say something to the effect of Mike DeYoung takes every dollar a hostage. But it was there, and this was exceedingly good news for a new government. So we were able to increase spending in a number of areas that were near and dear to the heart of an NDP government. The economy was still very strong. We had the lowest unemployment rate in the country, and so the Minister of Finance brought in a budget in the fall that was had a modest surplus. We got to February of 2018. The surplus was even bigger than she had projected, and so she was able to do another round of spending increases, and the economy kept chugging along. February of 2019, things still looked pretty good, so we didn't really feel acutely that it was health gets everything and nobody else gets anything. Now, going into February of 2020, I think there would have been some really tough choices, but then we had the pandemic, which gave every government in the Western world a pass on deficits. So never really had to be confronted to that point in time.
I don't want to trigger you by raising the BC Teachers Federation, so I'll stick with healthcare. How do you deal with, or what's your advice to policymakers or to people in your role dealing with vested interests like my old crowd in the trade union movement, or the doctors or others in healthcare? Because anyone who's been there knows that it's one thing to talk about reorganizing health spending on a rational way and another to do it.
Yeah.
Have you drawn any conclusions from watching over the years?
Well, I've got a conclusion that will probably take me off Adrian's Christmas card list. But I just don't think the basic monopoly on delivery by basically the government, no matter how you dress it up with health authorities, is going to be sustainable in the future. I think there needs to be a look at how you get some competition within the system, still maintaining the single payer role. And, I think it's worth taking a serious look at what goes on in Europe. I mean, these are not right-wing jurisdictions like Sweden, for example, but, they have a single payer system, but there's some competition within the system. Because I think that's the only way you can really surface when a hospital says we really don't have enough money to do what we're asked to do. Well, you need to have a comparator, and we don't have that comparator right now. So,
I mean, this is probably a full episode topic, but do we have a single payer system now when it comes down to it? Like WorkSafe BC jumps the queue, other entities can jump the queue. We can all run with our feet down to Bellingham if we choose to pay for it on our own. It just seems like BC's got an opportunity to actually repatriate a lot of healthcare dollars back into BC and support healthcare here at the same time improving service. I mean, it's a big public policy issue that is hindered by the politics of it. Maybe that's your next file, Don. Maybe you take that on next.
Well, I mean, I think I'm going to ramble around a little bit on this, Mike, but it's if it's going to be done, much better done by an NDP government than a right of center government for all
To
of
make
the
those
reasons.
changes, you mean?
Yeah.
Nixon
Yeah.
goes to China, yeah.
Like Gordon Campbell's changes in the aughts, they were pretty tough on working people. I mean, Geoff knows this well. In fact, my daughter was working as a hospital worker when those came in, and she lost her job. So you need to have somebody that is, I think, committed to maintaining the social equity lens, as well as what the core principles of a publicly funded system should be, but a willingness to experiment at the margins to see if we can't improve delivery.
Mhm.
And you're right. We do have a two-tier system. Boy, I'm really going to get off Adrian's Christmas card list here, but I'll make a confession. Back in 2021, my wife had a knee that she'd essentially become crippled, and she got on the waiting list here. They couldn't tell her how long it was going to be. And so we ended up flying up to Calgary and went in a private clinic and got it done there. And, I've been lucky enough in life that wasn't a financial burden on us. But that's the reality.
This is the all of government time, though, for healthcare and so many things. You were the head of the public service. I'm thinking not just of COVID-19, but actually years on end, even under the minority government where we were using emergency powers. When you think back on that period, I remember a conversation with you when we were watching the news, I think, in the Premier's office, and we saw Wuhan was shut down and commenting, we could never do that here. And then about 3 weeks later, we just about had to.
Yeah.
What are your recollections of that from a public service standpoint? It must have been unbelievable.
Well, yeah, it was. I'll maybe pat ourselves on the back a little bit. I think BC did relatively well compared to the other provinces in Canada in terms of how we managed that. And I think part of it was, we saw in January that this was going to be potentially big issue to deal with. And you may recall, Mike, Geoff, when I instituted those morning phone calls in late January, where we would, Bonnie Henry and Stephen and a few others would just do a situation monitor. And we didn't really accomplish much in those phone calls, but I think what it did is it got us thinking about this maybe 2 or 3 weeks earlier than the rest of the country started thinking about it. And so when the what did hit the fan, I just think we were a little better prepared for it. Even having said that, I had no inkling that we would be going into the lockdowns in the spring that we did. And you may recall it put a lot of strain on all of us on multiple dimensions. The one thing I'm quite proud of is the fact that BC actually locked down less than any other province in the country, and that we kept our schools with in-person classrooms for a much larger percentage of the time than the rest of Canada did. And I'm quite proud of that, actually.
No, rightly so.
Well, imagine COVID didn't happen and that government probably would have gone the extra year to 2021. You may have had some unfinished business that COVID detracted you from. I've seen the economic plan you had authored for the government, where you had a lot of ambitions there in terms of diversifying BC's economy. Were there things that you had planned to do that COVID derailed you on? before you had a chance to get to them?
Well, absolutely. And what you talked about was the primary one. Just a little bit of a clarification. That was not meant to be a public-facing document. It was really addressed to the public service.
Right.
Sort of, here is what we're doing. And really, if you look at it, it was basically everything that the government had already decided to do in a number of areas in terms of supporting mass timber construction, for example, or trying to encourage less concentration of activity in downtown Vancouver and things like that. But it was primarily for the public service. But my one thing I wished I'd had time to get around to is we didn't have chance to really have that much of a discussion about economics at the cabinet level. There was a few sessions on it, but we never really got to the point where we started wrestling with what are the trade-offs here, what do we want the economic base of the province to look like, and what are we prepared to do it. The reason we didn't get there before January of 2020 is governments essentially respond to pain points. And the economy wasn't a pain point for those first 2.5 years of its term. I think it would have become a pain point in 2020, but as we noted, COVID gave us a pass on all of that. So that's probably the prime.
Yeah, Don, if I had to summarize sort of Don Wright thought on the economy and the themes that you wanted to bring home to cabinet, I'd say one of them was you wanted to emphasize the continuing importance of the resource sector to the revenues of government and the dubious prospects of relying entirely on tech and innovation and those sorts of new, bright economic initiatives to pay the freight. Is that still a concern of yours? I mean, looking forward now, where is the economy of the province going, and how do you think we should think about paying for things as forestry declines and so on?
Yeah, and I think that's with a bit of a qualification, that would be the core of what I was arguing. I wouldn't describe tech as dubious. I just think its ability to replace the resource sector as the core of the economic base, it's a long ways off, if ever. And it also has particular challenges. We've grown a lot of interesting technologies in BC, and we get interesting looking startups, but not many of them make it through the valley of death. They either flounder economically, or somebody in Silicon Valley comes along and says, yeah, we like that technology, so we're going to buy you up. And then the intangible assets, some of which the people of BC invested in through various programs, just trundle down the I-5, and we don't have any lasting benefit from it. So it's not, I never saw it as an either or. I just thought we needed to keep things in proportion. I think the big challenges facing BC is the resource sector is not going to be able to carry the freight the way it did 40 years ago. The population has doubled for the last 40 years, but the amount of natural resources haven't doubled. And in fact, they've dwindled because of, in particular, the aftermath of the beetle in the forest sector. I think that what we need to do is we need to think through how we actually try to anchor the intangible assets that we create in BC so that it is not improbable that a Google type company or an Amazon type company or something in the life sciences can grow and stay headquartered in BC with most of the activity there. In terms of what the state of the economy is, the thing that I worry the most about right now is we've had this hollowing out because of the resource sector, but we haven't replaced it. But we have a false sense of prosperity because of what is essentially a real estate bubble. We have had so many people moving into BC over the last 20 years, and they bring their money and income earned elsewhere and buy houses. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that in the long run, it's got us to the position where if you're a Gen Zer and you don't have a well-capitalized bank of mom and dad, you are never owning a house. And I just think that's a grim prospect for society.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to figure out how we can kind of get ourselves off the addiction to the real estate bubble and grow other parts of the economic base.
Don, I want to pick up on that from some of your writings in the Public Policy Forum.
Mm.
You seem to have studied post-war Canadian economic planning and how the middle class grew consistently for several decades before it started to flatline in the mid to late 70s. And you've referred to as the good society, the ambition of the good society. And so just building on that previous conversation, what do you see as the other ingredients for rebuilding the middle class and creating wage growth over time, since it's been stagnant?
Yeah. So, I think the core is actually having governments commit to the notion that we want to create a economy where the average person does see a real increase in their wages year over year of, 2.5%. It doesn't sound like a lot, but when you compound that over a period of time, it historically anyways translated into each generation essentially having twice the standard of living of its parents. And I think that's the core of a good society. I mean, I have said on occasion that the path to the good society runs through the prosperity of the middle class. If you don't have the prosperity of the middle class, first of all, they're not going to feel they're participating in the good society, but furthermore, they're going to resent the types of expenditures for social equity that allow other parts of the society to share in the prosperity. So you need to have a commitment to that, not just in a rhetorical sense, but in a real sense. And I think it primarily comes back to the labor market. You need to have the demand for, the relative demand and supply of labor such that workers are able to extract a real wage increase year over year on average. And we haven't had that for a long time. And I think it's partly to do with something that's near and dear to Geoff's heart. The unions have a significant role to play, but unions in the private sector. I mean, the public sector unions, they have an important role to play, but essentially this is going to be determined with what's going on in the private sector. And then the federal government, I think, really needs to do a rethink of its immigration policy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say you're ahead of the curve on that, Don. I just want to flag for listeners. It's something you've been saying long before it became part of general discussion.
Yeah. And I frankly just don't understand why the federal government has been so obdurate on this. Particularly the temporary foreign workers. It mystifies me why they think that's good public policy. It really does.
The listeners can Google Don's columns in Business in Vancouver and other places for, kind of your argument on that and the stats that you bring to that. I mean, from a political perspective, one wonders whether the federal Liberals just think it's good politics. You bring in more immigrants to the country than of ultimately voting. Who do they thank for their their passport?
Yeah, and I mean, at one level, I understand that, Mike. And I think my own family, my grandfather came to Canada. He's a poor working class kid from Sheffield, England. He landed here in 1909, and Wilfrid Laurier was the prime minister, and so he was a lifelong liberal. So, there's probably something to that. But I think what they've missed is, as they have, in my opinion, overdone it. Some of the people most adversely affected by high levels of immigration is the previous cohort of immigrants, because they're largely competing in the same labor market and the same housing market. And I've seen a little bit of polling that suggests actually the people that are not born in Canada but have been here a while, they're not thrilled by these high immigration numbers either. So
do you dial it back?
Technological change that's sweeping in now. I mean, we see it all now with that, even in the grocery store, where we get to check out our own groceries because it's so much more efficient.
Yeah.
Do you worry that
it's not much more efficient for me, I can tell you, but I know what you're saying.
No, I struggle with the vegetables too. But I think the question is, are we going to see a compounding of this difficulty where the labor supply is expanded by technology as well as by immigration, and wind up in real difficulty in terms of affordability? Is that something you worry about?
I'm worried about it in the sense that the governments need to make kind of parallel changes in their fiscal and monetary policy to blunt it. So if technological change is going on and productivity per person hour is going up, that's good news if you are have monetary policy and fiscal policy that is going to encourage aggregate demand to go up, so that collectively we need more goods and services produced, so the workers that have become more productive or been freed up can be employed in producing that extra output. The mistake would be okay, we let all of this productivity increase happen, but we don't do the things that will increase aggregate demand, and so we're essentially just having fewer people create the same sized pie.
So Mike, if I can just turn the topic one more way, I would say, Don, you're a technological optimist. However, when it comes to climate change, and you were steering the public service at the point that Clean BC was created, and the foundations were laid for what is a very ambitious program of emissions reductions. But I remember you expressing some concern or skepticism even that some of the regulatory measures would work, and hope and optimism that technological changes would come into play. Where do you see the climate issue sitting right now, both from an economic and kind of policy standpoint?
Yeah, so I'm at risk of getting myself out of George Hayman's Christmas card list now too. But
wait a minute, you were on it?
Touche. I think what you're seeing around the world is governments not explicitly, but implicitly backing away from the net zero by 2050. When you look at what's going on over in Europe, for example, you're seeing more and more public pushback on what's happening. Let me be clear. I think climate change is a serious issue, and we need to take steps to decarbonize the economy, but I think it's a question of how quickly can we get to net zero and not do real economic damage. And I think all of the technologies we need aren't here yet. I'm an optimist that they will be developed, but we still have a ways to go. And my concern about BC or Canada is we would pay a price if we try to go more quickly than the rest of the world does. I like to say it's great to be a leader, but you need to look over your shoulder once in a while to make sure you've got followers. And I think we need to watch that carefully.
Well, the carbon tax debate coming to a theater near us soon. in terms of BC's distance
Yeah.
from other provinces, perhaps widening. But on the
I
climate stuff,
if I just
yeah.
if I can, I just have to point out that back in 2006 or 7, a colleague of mine and me wrote an op-ed in the Vancouver Sun arguing for the carbon price and a carbon tax, and that this is the way to go. And
so it's your fault.
This is before my children explained to me that you never read the comments. And so I read, and I kind of chuckled because some guy referred to Bruce and I as a bunch of ass clowns. So that was my inauguration into the.
I think I know that guy. Well, I was just going to say on the climate thing, like we've got emissions of whatever it is, 62 million tons per year. At the same time, I mean, as Premier Horgan had noted on our podcast, we are a small little dot on the globe, and we can do things to help lower emissions globally through low emission gas that comes from the Montney and is exported, and especially if it's electrified. But that would boost our domestic emissions, but lower global emissions. And what's your view on that in terms of how the province and maybe the federal government can square that?
Yeah. So in theory, there is a vehicle to square that through what's called Article 6 in the Paris Agreement. The problem is it's not clear that Article 6 is ever going to be fleshed out in a way that is actually workable. I think that there is a real problem with the Paris construct where everything is measured in terms of a particular jurisdiction's emissions. It doesn't really allow you to take a global point of view. And, I think where we need to go eventually is along the lines that some have sketched out, where jurisdictions that are putting a price on carbon and are doing the right stuff can start putting tariffs on imports of jurisdictions that aren't doing that. And I think that may be how you get the right incentives across the globe to do that.
Interesting. Don, in the time we've got left here, I just want to shift gears. As you know, my sister passed away from ALS a couple years ago, and during her short time as between her diagnosis and her passing, she got very involved in a group called ALS Action Canada with another person I wanted to pay tribute to here, Greg Gow, who was a former legislative intern in Victoria, who also passed away from ALS, made a tremendous contribution as an advocate and activist during his time fighting that issue. And you've stepped up to be the chair of ALS Action Canada, a fledgling group that's advocating for policy change. First of all, I want to thank you for doing that. Secondly, though, fill us in with where you're at with ALS Action Canada and what you're trying to accomplish.
Sure. Yeah, thanks very much for giving me the opportunity. So I don't have any personal connection to ALS, but a person I worked with 25 years ago, their son was diagnosed with ALS, and they were with Greg, one of the founders of ALS Action Canada. What they, if you don't mind the more full-throated advertisement, this was 7 people that had been diagnosed with ALS. And when they went to their doctors to hear what could be done about their situation, they were basically told nothing could be done about their situation, that there were no treatments, that there was no prospect for hope, that their life expectancy would be 3 years on average, and that their life would get grimmer and grimmer. And you witnessed this with your sister, and she had an incredible blog. I just was amazed at the courage she showed through all of it. And this 7 just said, well, that's not good enough, and maybe there's no hope for us, but we need to do something to make it so that people in the future will have hope. So they set this little nonprofit up called ALS Action Canada, determined to lobby for Health Canada to approve experimental drugs more quickly, to get more clinical trials available across the country, and to get better access to drugs that had been approved. And I got asked to sit on the board. I really didn't know that much about ALS when I agreed to. I knew it was a fatal disease, and I knew Lou Gehrig's disease and all that stuff. But until you actually sit with people and you watch them get robbed of their humanity right before your eyes, you just realize just what a cruel disease this is. And once you've been exposed to that, you can't turn your back on it.
Yeah.
So we've set this up. We are, we have one incredible member, Mark Curtin. He formerly played for the Maple Leafs and the Canucks, and has kept connected to his people there. And we've got arrangements with all of the NHL Canadian teams that they will help us fundraise. It'll be in March, where there will be a game in with the Canucks.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So that's be exciting. And we're starting to get some traction. We've raised about $1 million now. And we're going to use it strategically to fund research in terms of understanding better who has ALS. There isn't even the rudimentary database in terms of who has ALS across the country, what are the characteristics, what are the markers, and promoting clinical trials. And it is just awe-inspiring to be involved with these people. Like, I may get a little teary, but people like Greg or Mark. Mark, he said there must be a reason why I got this, and I'm going to use my time available to do something about it. And just can't help but be in awe of somebody like that. So I would encourage people to check us out. It's ALS Action Canada. Any donations gratefully received. If you know people with ALS, please steer them to us, because we have self-help groups that meet bi-weekly virtually and talk about what problems they have, and we're just creating a real community here. So thanks for giving me the opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we like to thank you for dropping by Hotel Pacifico. We hope you'll come back sometime. There's a lot more we could talk about, endless topics that you can lend your wisdom to.
Yeah.
And this was a good first run today. So book your future stays soon, bonus points, and all sorts of things.
Well, I'm disappointed. I thought there was going to be a drink that I got to have.
You could. Do you have you could have a preliminary raise a glass or shot if you'd like. Do you have one?
No, I'm just joking, because I love the banter that you three have about, okay, now it's time to go to the mini bar.
Jeff and I are going to get wasted in about 10 minutes.
Yeah. It's great to see you, Don. And
great to see you, Jeff. And I enjoyed this, but I really enjoy your show. It's just a lot of fun listening to it, and it's got good substance to it. So congratulations.
Great. Well, you certainly treated me better than Glenn Clark. So there you go.
That was your government. That was your government, Mike.
Yes, was my
government.
Caused
all that degradation.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, I actually gave you a compliment, because I mentioned the bag of money that Mike DeYoung left us. So.
Yeah. Well, okay. I can't let that go undefended. You did say in your paper that I read, voluminous paper on the middle class, that under Keynesian economics, it is optimal for governments to be leaving surpluses in good times. So I will just say that the Christy Clark government was following the Don Wright policy prescription when they did that. So
fair enough.
There's ankle deep surpluses, and then there's up to your eyebrow surpluses.
Boy, you guys can't let it go, can you? All right. Well, thanks, Don.
That was about the best thing that happened to us in those few weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
That's enough.
Right.
Okay. Thanks,
A
Don.
lot of fun. Thanks.
Bye now.
Guests, last week we discussed the need for world-class networks and connectivity to drive the future of autonomous vehicles. This week, we're going to look at another industry that is quickly advancing into the autonomous space, mining. But I want to pause before we do, because I know I'm dropping some real Jetsons or even, God help us, Black Mirror type references lately. So I want to assure you these autonomous technologies aren't futuristic science fiction. They're now. So let me tell you about an autonomous tech innovation that is revolutionizing the mining industry today. That tech weighs about 70 pounds, walks on 4 legs, and is a very good boy. I'm talking about Spot, a dog-like AI robot developed by Boston Dynamics that is being deployed to make mining safer and more efficient. In mines right here in BC, you can see Spot run, see Spot navigate dark, uneven terrain, see Spot reach places that are unsafe or challenging for humans, collect data, and conduct routine inspections. See Spot improve mining practices for critical minerals and optimize the supply chains that will make Canada a global leader in battery manufacturing. And guess? Spot needs ultra-low latency, reliable 5G and fiber networks like the ones the presenting sponsor TELUS is building. In fact, TELUS is working closely with Boston Dynamics to make sure Spot stays connected even in dangerous and remote places. With more companies investing in battery plants in BC and elsewhere in Canada, we need critical minerals to be mined as safely and efficiently as possible, with minimal impact on the environment. As the world quickly approaches an autonomous future where industries in all sectors of work rely more and more on advanced network technologies to automate their work, Canada has a unique opportunity to lead. See Spot run, see 5G technologies run, see BC's economy run in a safe and sustainable way.
Hello. You've reached the Hotel Pacifico Strategy Suite.
It's a little roomy in here without Kate, and we didn't bring in a third wheel. We thought us two old guys can handle it today. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of it, I just want to follow up on Don Wright's interview that you just heard a few moments ago. He mentioned my sister's blog, and I just wanted to let our listeners know that website. It's, even though she's passed away 2 years ago, the website's WordPress site is still up. It's Sarah's alslife.wordpress.com. And if you know someone who has ALS, a family member, you might find some comfort in some of my sister's blog posts that she wrote while she was undergoing the experience, and she wrote with considerable grace and humor, including people have a bucket list, and she had a fucket list. And you might enjoy that blog post. Anyways, back to politics. Geoff, Selena Robinson, no longer cabinet minister.
Yeah, we're really a big loss for all kinds of reasons. A big loss for David Eby. I mean, I of course, her remarks were deplorable, but I want to come back to that in a minute. I mean, when you think about, I know Selena Robinson, of course, personally, and I've always admired the fact that she was very open and frank about her Jewish faith. She has had a long career in politics. She's a cancer survivor. She was a city councillor in Coquitlam. She's held 3 portfolios, including finance. She was one of the great frontbenchers, and since the Hamas terror attacks on October the 7th, she's also been the recipient of direct anti-Semitic attacks, one of which I witnessed outside the NDP convention, where people were chanting her name and calling her a genocidist and so forth. So none of this, of course, is to excuse the remarks which she herself has apologized for repeatedly on the B'nai B'rith Zoom call. We could deconstruct the risks of Zoom calls and all of that kind of thing, but I do think that while her apology was warranted and the Premier's now made the decision to take her out of cabinet, it is a big loss, and she's an important person whose, I think, career contribution should be remembered in its entirety and not just for this incident. When it was clear that there were 2 parts to the problem, I think. One, the allegations that she rejected, that she'd improperly interfered in the discipline of a pro-Palestinian lecturer at Langara. That was a serious question on its own that was not going to disappear overnight. But the viral spread of her comments that led to her first apology were, the combination, I think, was insupportable in terms of continuing in the post-secondary role. And my regret, I think, is on everybody's behalf, is that that wasn't understood sooner. The other name I want to mention in the context of Selena's tribulations is Haroon Khan, who I also know personally, his father was the founder of the first mosque in BC at Fairview in Vancouver. He's a really important leader in the Muslim community. He's very committed to interfaith dialogue, including with the Jewish community. He's been involved in countless charitable works. And when Haroon Khan says that the apology won't cut it, you have a problem politically. And it was at that point that I think her situation became untenable. And it's, I think, too bad that it lasted as long as it did. So a very, very tough week for Premier David Eby and for his team. And it ended, as I'm sure you can imagine, Mike, very difficult. I can only imagine. I have no inside knowledge of what happened, but a very profound second apology yesterday morning, Monday morning. We're talking now on Tuesday. Then a caucus meeting with a demonstration outside presenting all of this. Must have been a really miserable day, but it's over now, and we'll see what happens next. I think there will be significant damage done for Premier Eby's team, both in the Muslim community and in the Jewish community, as a result of how this all unfolded. And it's just further blowback and collateral damage all over the place from this terrible war. So really remarkable few days in BC politics, and very difficult outcomes, particularly for Selina Robinson.
Yeah, it's the divisiveness that the events of October 7th bring to BC politics certainly on display. Frankly, I don't know what the circumstances were with her involvement with Langara on the issue of that disciplinary action. I would applaud it if she had told them to be tough and deal with it, given the comments that that person made at a rally applauding Hamas. And basically, I would view it as a version of a hate crime. So leaving that aside, though, her comments did create a political problem for the government. Rustad and Falcon did not call for her resignation.
I'm glad you raised that. Yeah,
they explicitly said she should not resign. I can't think of many instances where opposition leaders have said their rival should not resign, and they were, basically forced to resign. Now, I recognize that those comments that she made, which were ill-advised from a political point of view for sure, created a big headache for the premier, and they may have been running out of options there. However, she's your only Jewish member of caucus, I believe, and CJA put out the Jewish Advocacy Group, Canadian. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but CJA put out a statement last night.
Canadian Institute for Jewish Affairs, the BC section. Yeah,
very, very upset about it, and they made the comment that the Premier's office himself had put out a tweet the previous week on Holocaust Remembrance Day, erroneously linking it to the Muslim community. And CJA said they forgave the Premier. They didn't make a big deal about it. They took the Premier's office at its word when that mistake was made, and they don't feel they received the same treatment back. So that's fallout from this too. It's a no-win situation politically. They're at where they're at on it, but it's obviously Selina Robinson pays the price.
Yeah, and she has been a really outstanding, front bencher for the government in both administrations. But I was also surprised to learn, which I only learned in the statement from the NDP caucus yesterday, that she had decided not to run again, which she says is a decision she'd previously made. So that's an interesting contextual point as well. But I don't think none of that really matters against, I think, your summation of it. There's really no silver linings here. I was surprised and interested. I didn't know that they had positively said she should not resign, but I thought the silence that I was hearing from both of the opposition parties was very important.
Well, you can tell me that this isn't a factor at all, but they have a history, the Premier and the Minister, in terms of clashing at Treasury Board, BC Housing transition from her to Eby and the firing of that board. She didn't. One of the few MLAs that didn't support him in the leadership. I think 48 out of 57 supported him, and she was one of the holdouts and thought about running for a while. Do you think that had a factor at all in that, in the Premier's response?
It's hard to argue that it did, because if there was a sense of distance or separation between them, it wasn't on show yesterday at his news conference.
Yeah.
And I think there are those who would argue that he could have moved more forcefully earlier, and maybe the damage to her personally would have been less. Who knows? I mean, these are all, after the fact,
Yeah.
considerations. I think the problem that is a larger political consideration, and I'll take it to the South Asian community for a minute, is that uh, political perspectives in diaspora communities, and it's the Jewish community is deeply rooted in BC. It's not the same as some other communities. They all have their own dynamics. But take, for example, the situation about people who are sympathetic to Punjabi separatism are not all terrorists. They're not all Khalistani terrorists. They're not all people who would advocate bombing the Air India bomber, but some of them are. And it's very, very difficult and challenging politically to navigate in those waters, because a politician will be invited to particular settings where they may feel quite uncomfortable with some of the people who are celebrating in a faith setting with them, but are not in a position to say, well, I'm not, I'm not interested in being around you. And so we've all seen circumstances where people get their picture taken with someone and they regret it later, because they're then associated with someone who they may not have even realized was in the frame with them when the picture was taken. And that can be true in any part of the community, but it's particularly high risk for people who are familiar with specific communities and spending time in them. So I think, what was interesting here was that swing that has occurred, and I'm not sure how big it is, but the political weight accorded to the Muslim community was significant this time, and it was bigger than I would have expected in the past. That's not to say that their concerns should have been minimized anyway. I think that they were strongly held and in good faith views that they brought forward.
Okay, so from Selena to Sonia. Sonia First to Know made a surprising announcement this week, the Green Party leader, that she was switching ridings from Cowichan Valley to Victoria Beacon Hill. This isn't the first time a Green leader has decided to go on frankly, a kamikaze mission in Victoria Beacon Hill, because I believe Jane Stirk challenged Carol James a few elections ago. I gather that First Know's riding was changing. It was split, and not necessarily in half, but a good chunk of her riding was sent south, and I guess to Souk and Shawnigan were joined, or something like that.
If there's a non-green part of that neck of the woods, is Souk.
Yeah.
So in the redistribution, she lost Shawnigan Lake, where she'd been working hard for years on environmental issues there, and gained Souk, where she may not have been able to get to the front of too many queues, given there's still some resource workers out there and some Indigenous folks who may be frustrated by Ferry Creek and you name it.
The Green Party may not have realized that in electoral boundaries commissions that the NDP sends lots of average people to go make community-minded arguments in favor of certain electoral boundaries, as well as BC Liberals / United.
I was going to say the voters are anxious to make sure it's done right.
Exactly. It's a civic duty.
Yeah.
But maybe the Greens were still waiting for proportional representation to happen. I'm not sure.
But let's just look at what she actually said when challenged by Richard Zisman. She said, "It's about my family." That was the first words out of her mouth. So I don't think that there's a political consideration here. If there is, it's very hard to decode. And it's a comment I know I keep trying to make, and I'll try to drop it as soon as the election's over. But the Green Party was the critical factor in the creation of the minority CASA agreement and so forth in 2017. They don't appear to be on track to repeat that or to grow. I think they could easily lose both Beacon Hill and the place she left behind.
Well, yeah. And, Grace Lohr's now in cabinet, and she appears to be following in the footsteps of Carol James in terms of inheriting that organization there. So the Greens would have to find an issue that really captivates voters in Victoria to knock them off the NDP, and I'm not sure what that is. I mean, Adam Olsen probably is in pretty good shape. He may be the next leader of the Greens if he's the last man
That would
standing.
be his third time as leader, I think.
Has he been acting leader a couple times? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, he's the go-to guy, and he's a capable person too.
And he's in the media a lot, and he's very well regarded. They have a shot at West Vancita Sky. They lost by a handful of votes last time. But anyways, we'll have to see how it works out for First to Know. It's a tough choice. I'm not sure. I guess Oak Bay, Gordon Head, might have been a riding I would have suggested, but then, Dr. Weaver would be, flying around as like a vampire bat, haunting her, if she ran there, perhaps. So
Well,
lots of
I think
complicated.
Sonia, for all of her capabilities and her commitment, has not been finding her way in leadership here, because she brought in a deputy leader who decided to run against Adrian Dix and then
Right.
had to be fired because of comments he
Yeah.
made about the Middle East
Yeah.
and so forth. So they're not on a good trajectory, and that's good news for David Eby's team.
Yeah, and Olson's formidable too. He is emerged as, I would say he's almost has that kind of status where he wins regardless of party label, because he's, some MLAs just transcend their party.
No, I agree.
And,
I agree.
and
I think
I think he's in that
he can have the
neighborhood.
seat as long as he wants, I think.
Yeah. Right. So what else? Let's just talk about the general polling situation. There were some public polls out in the last week that was more bad news for BC
Well, you're more
United.
pollster than I am, Mike. I mean, I was challenged by someone, can this be real? Is it an outlier?
Yeah.
Kevin Falcon at 16%, but it seems to be real. Is it real?
Well,
16,
it's real,
17?
and it's real in so much as when people receive a survey and they answer, and they and those are the numbers, that's real. Like, there's enough polls that show that that's in the neighborhood. Now, when you get into a campaign situation and people wake up and say, like, okay, who's my running in my riding? And, who are these, the guys who used to be the government? And those are the conservatives aren't really the conservatives. That can make a difference. But it's, look, let's face it. If the NDP's in the mid 40s and the next closest party is in the mid 20s, it is going to be a slaughter. And one party has to emerge to challenge the NDP. And right now, it's not clear who that would be. The Conservatives would argue it's them based on these current polling results, but they will hit a brick wall. They do not have, not only do they not have the organizational depth, which some could argue that there's lots of precedents why that doesn't matter. I don't think Rustad's got the juice to take it to a higher level. I just don't think he's the personality to do it, quite honestly. And also, they are not taking on a policy set that is going to help them grow the pie. I mean, going after Bonnie Henry and calling on her to fire Bonnie Henry, I mean, that may make the base feel good, and like
Yeah, but Mike,
a
I go
small
back to
base,
the
it's not going to grow them with women. It's not going to
for
grow
Hotel
them.
Pacifico listeners will remember the clinic that Jess Ketchum gave us on what
Yeah.
leading circles in BC did go and confront her with this problem after Dave
Yeah.
Barrett, which was a generation ago.
Yeah.
They were able to call a meeting that people felt they had to come to, and then took out Gordon Wilson. I'm drastically summarizing here, but I don't know if there is such a committee today.
That
And I
is
don't know if
not
John
what I
Rustad would
heard
even
on
answer the
that is
call.
not what I heard on the Jeff Ketchum podcast.
Okay, well,
We
anyway,
heard two different podcasts.
I was closely
Well,
listening.
there were many meetings made.
It's a very different
There was not
time.
one singular.
I think we would agree on it. It's a very different time now. And there isn't the ability of a group of people who are concerned about the free enterprise option. Jess said this, what was the unifying factor? Not the NDP. And clearly that's no longer the the magic potion that it used to be.
No, it's not, because as we talked with Glenn, in previous era, it was all about the class and bosses versus workers and things like that. And we have different dimensions now. Today, climate's a bigger deal. There's a different strand of populism today that's less about economics and more about values. Polyev himself, I mean, basically, if you look at those numbers that have been in the polls lately, BC United and BC Conservatives add up to about 40. And Polyev's probably polling around 40 in BC. So the federal Conservatives are doing very well. And you have two provincial parties basically under their umbrella in terms of the voter coalition. The federal Liberals are with Eby for the most part.
Right.
And in fact, I noted, I saw a news item today that a federal MP, John Aldag, is considering running for the provincial NDP. So that's kind of a further proof point of that. Now, there's certainly federal Liberals that are supporting BC United at the kind of organizer elite level, but the voters have been walking with their feet, and it's hard to see the recipe to put that together. So it's the option is an all in on the Conservative side where those two parties cooperate. But I don't know that anyone sees a pathway to that right now.
Well, and I think the critical question for David Eby and his team is to do less but do it better, because they can't afford too many weeks like the last one they had. We don't have time today to talk about the Land Act, but it's important to make sure that every day is as quiet and as happy as possible in the lead up to the election, and I'm sure that's what they're all very focused on.
Let's raise a glass or take a shot. Time to raid the minibar.
I'm going to take a shot at Mayor Ken Sim today. I hope I'm not repeating myself. When I went to the State of the City address, and Mayor Sim, I doubt you're listening, but if in fact you are, there are bigger things going on in the city than the Stanley Park train. I agree, FIFA World Cup is a great thing, and I'm glad that's happening. But there are major developments underway, massive decisions that involve Indigenous interests, questions over infrastructure, even whether or not the city of Vancouver will continue to lead the region in growth and political heft and business heft, or is it going to be Surrey? And I think some of those things should be in your next State of the City address. Otherwise, you'll risk turning into some kind of a small town mayor the way things are going. So sorry, a bit harsh, but I was looking for more than I got.
We'll have to see what Tough Grandma is saying in her State of the City address in Surrey whenever that's happening, by comparison. I'm going to take a shot at Nathan Cullen today, and I think he's already taken a shot at himself, which was the rollout of the Land Act engagement that's going to precede legislation. They are signaling that will come down this spring. He's acknowledged that it was a mistake not to at least issue a press release, but also be more inviting of a public conversation. And I think Vaughn Palmer's written a lot on this. And I think this is the type of issue, these are tough issues around UNDRIP. I think there's broad public support for reconciliation. However, when there's not a lot of transparency, it does create some fears among regular people, let alone those who have agendas to drive. So I'm hoping that, he'll be good to his word and kickstart a more fulsome public conversation on that. I think would be healthy and could be healthy and productive. However, it's not going to be easy. There we go. That's it for us at Hotel Pacifico this week. See, when Kate's here, she manages to rein Geoff and I in. We were quite loquacious today, but next time we'll be more succinct with our wisdom.
No more loquacious. No more loquacious.
Kate will help us with that.
We miss Kate.
We do miss Kate, but thank you to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, for helping make this episode happen. Thank you to Don Wright for joining us. And we look forward to seeing all of our guests again next week here at Hotel Pacifico.
Check out time at Hotel Pacifico. We hope you enjoyed your stay.